Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back, Professor Backer. We are here to discuss Chapter 3 of Between One Country and Two System about Hong Kong. Today's Chapter 3 is Mindbreak, the Chinese position on the situation in Hong Kong, the statement from the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
All right, all right. This is now going to get fun. We're moving into that period, that early period when kind of everything starts getting fixed. So it's a kind of interesting part of the early part of the materials. So ready to go.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it at the time, and again, we keep emphasizing this over the course of our conversations. We're now at the end of July, and a ton of stuff has happened, and everyone's been surprised because, again, there was a sense that maybe this was going to linger, but certainly starting from the violence that occurred like 4 or 5 days after the beginning of 3 days, was it? Yeah, 3 days after the beginning of the protests through the end of July, it begins to become clear by the end of July that this is something very different than umbrella, and that it's something different than anything we've gotten before. And now people, and by people, I mean the local authorities in Hong Kong, but more importantly, the central authorities in Beijing through their representatives in the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, the protesters, and again, there's no protest movement as a singular, all of that constellation of protesters who are aligned, although they're not unified in the sense of a command and control structure, and the foreign stakeholders, both private companies but especially governments, are now beginning to react. And it's in these moments between the 12th of June, which marked the beginning of the violence, and the beginning the beginning of response at the end of July, that you begin to see developing again. Although we didn't know this at the time, it was just weird to watch this go on. What you begin to see is the development of positions that then take another 6 months to refine, and refine really, really well. And from the perspective of the Chinese central authorities, far more successfully than virtually anyone else. And then taking this out to where this ends a year later. And so the end of July is a very interesting time in this context.
So do you believe that the parties that participate in this, mostly speaking about the central government, were they decisive and consistent in their positioning and posturing, in which they did not change the course on what was decided at this point?
Well, yeah, again, interesting. At the time, no one was thinking in that way, but in retrospect, in order to understand where the central authorities wind up in a very refined and sophisticated way in July of 2020, you really have to go back, I think, and read carefully the initial statements, which is essentially chapter 3, and then I guess later on we'll talk about chapter 4. The initial statements of the central authorities, and here you begin to see the identification of those building blocks that will then be developed and developed very, very precisely over the course of the year. But again, at the end of July, all we saw was this, and we're going, wow, okay, there are some things coming up here which one might not have expected, or which one might. And certainly my friends in the West and some of my friends in the protest camp just dismissed as, oh, this is a typical central authority speak. It's central authority sloganeering, and we've heard this all before, and there's really no reason to take this particularly seriously. Although now when you look at it, and I did not share the view, which is why, in fact, I spent a lot of time looking at this, but as it turns out in retrospect, it wasn't mere sloganeering. It was a very sophisticated application of the development of ideology that was already in Genesis in Beijing, now refined eventually and applied very, very successfully. We didn't know this at the time, to the context of Hong Kong. So that's what makes this interesting. And so, but the chapter is written without knowing any of this yet. It's just, wow, here it is. Let's look at this. What do you think they're doing? And for me, the most important thing at this time, because oddly enough, and you see, of course, that here we talk about men break, Dishi, and my pronunciation is terrible, so you all have to, excuse me. Guiguzi, the master of Guigu, which is probably just horribly destroying the way you're supposed to say it, and so forgive me. But I had started on the recommendation of a dear friend, Flora Sapio from Italy, to read very carefully at the time the one of the earliest books on Chinese rhetoric. And so I was reading this, I had been reading Zhang Shigang at a month before as I was coming into Hong Kong, but I always read Zhang. He's always got something really, really interesting to say. And I started reading the rhetoric. I'd read other things, but I hadn't read the rhetorical thing. I was just struck. So as I was reading through that initial statement from the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, the thing that kept popping into my head was, oh my God, I've seen this. Where have I seen this? And what came to my head was men break. Men. And the notion, and this is how I start the chapter, of course, the notion of crevices becoming rifts, becoming ravines, and then becoming an abyss, and then the strategy of both encouraging breaking and then encouraging mending, but you're not mending to go back, you're mending after you break, or you break after you mend. And it was just, so it sort of fit in nicely here. And I tried to weave these just beautifully sophisticated and quite ancient Chinese rhetorical notions to the extent I could. Again, I am no master at this stuff. I was just struck.
Understandable.
My own way to what was going to this extraordinary response that was, from my perspective at the time, that was put together by the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, which really should be required reading for anyone who is looking at this period in Hong Kong's history.
So, and you're right. I think looking back at it, everyone has a better perspective of what to look for in the statements. And so I would ask you, so what was the significance of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office statement?
Oh, on this one, again, it lays the groundwork. And most of the themes that are going to be developed, I think, over the course of the next year are here. Mm-hmm. The notion of misunderstanding, and underlying that, the notion of the necessity of the guidance and leadership of the vanguard to lead people towards a proper understanding of the way the political context ought to be both interpreted and then applied. The notion of the pernicious effects of outside influence begins to be heard here. And then that's also developed, and it becomes a critical leitmotif, a critical motif that is repeated over and over, and developed really in quite important ways. The way in which this is framed around the extradition law, but a sense already that we're no longer really talking, the extradition law is a metaphor perhaps, or a gateway, and that in a sense, we're moving beyond that, although we can keep the discourse to the extradition law and the issues around that. The notions of rupture, this is the men break part, the violence, the lawlessness, which separates. We begin to see here this theme of separating the lawlessness, and therefore the thing that looks like protest but isn't protest. It's really something quite more pernicious, versus the discourse and the discussion about differences, but mostly the focusing on the violence and alarmism, and the beginnings of things like the warnings about the consequences of this continued violence and radicalization, the beginning of the description of the violence in the protest movement as extremists, ultimately as, are they really Hong Kong people, or are they really nothing more than to use a Maoist expression, the running dogs of what eventually may also be viewed, again, to use a Maoist terms, the paper tigers of foreign stakeholders who are meddling in the internal affairs of China. All of this is now being come out. The willingness, the muscularity of China, of the Chinese political economic system, it's the willingness of the state to defend it and to develop it and apply it in Hong Kong. That is something new, and to some extent a really important element of this thing, this muscularity of Chinese pride in their system from the central authorities, and again, the different conceptual starting points for rule of law discussions about Hong Kong, and at least at this early stage, this ends by the end of this process in the spring of 2020. The willingness to use rule of law concepts in the sense of allowing the local authorities to take the lead under the guidance of the vanguard that sits, beyond Hong Kong. So all of these things are here. We're going to talk about each and every one of these in much more detail over the course of the next, oh my God, there's like a million chapters, the next 20 odd 25 or 26 odd chapters, but it's all here. And we'll refer back to them, but it's all here, not fully developed by any stretch, but a lot of these themes you can already begin to see here.
So I'm sure the central authorities, I guess you say the agitation with the international community contributed to these messages being sent out by them and these actions.
Right, we'll talk about that more in later chapters, but we begin at least dotted lines between the notion of the role of the foreign in a space that had been returned from and perhaps corrupted by the foreign. And we saw hints of this, of course, in the prior chapter, in the notions of the movement from old style, now obsolete imperial model to new style models that is represented by the new China, and within the new China, the new Hong Kong. But it's, and then its connection to the development of anti-patriotic forces that may well be represented within the protest movement itself. All in a very, very not yet developed way, but it's all here. And we're going to see all of this develop later.
And what can you say for the support for Carrie Lam's government at the time?
Yes, officially support for, but a kind of guided support. And again, this was a very interesting time. And as I recall, there was a bit of talk about this. To some extent, she continued to be fully supported, of course, by the central authorities. At the same time, given her weakness in the sense of having been unable to manage this, at least to some, remember the last time we talked about managing the pot so that it is warm, but it's not boiling over. Her inability to keep this pot simmering, but not boiling, appeared to require the intervention of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, probably much more behind closed doors, but in a sense to begin to give public guidance in the context of public support, but the effect of which was to begin by the deployment of this guidance to constrain the ability of the local authorities to move beyond the themes and the approach that this guidance suggested. So yes, there was support, but it's the kind of support is the kind of support that also suggested that well, if I'm in need of guidance, then this is not just support for what I'm doing, but it's literally support because of my inability to do what I was supposed to be doing. So a crutch as well as a feeling of, go ahead and of responsibility.
It's interesting. The way I saw this chapter, I understood it more like a Where's Waldo picture, where you painted this great picture that will lead to further discussions in future chapters. But those will require what are those things? What magnifying glasses? Those will require magnifying glasses to be able to see exactly what you were trying to show in this large picture, in this large painting that you put out for us in chapter 2.
Right.
Is there,
You mean in chapter 3 here?
chapter
Oh, okay, in chapter 2, and then magnified here, the Waldo here in chapter 3. Yeah, but remember again, yes, that's absolutely right. But at the end of July, we had no idea. We had
yes.
no idea it was going to go. In retrospect, you go, oh my God. So I read this, you read this back as I was finishing the book, and I went, oh, wow. Okay. I wish, like everyone else does, if I'd known what I know in June of 2020, back in July of 2019, right, the spin of this stuff would have been very different.
Yeah, it's like knowing who, I won't say the bad guy in a movie is, but I will say the bad guy in a movie. It's like knowing everyone's role in a movie while they don't know each other's role. And because you know the ending, or you know what you know in hindsight, and you continue to read the book as such, and you go dun 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 for some, and for others you say that's not going to be the way you continue to act.
Right. But remember as well, mend break becomes a key strategy here. We're mending Hong Kong into China.
Mm-hmm.
We're breaking Hong Kong and its strong normative connection to the West. We are mending the patriotic connection of the people of Hong Kong to China. We are breaking a kind of normative adherence to Western or globalized principles of political and civil rights. So there's, in all of this stuff, we are mending lawfulness. We are breaking by identifying, by creating the rift, moving from a break to a rift, to a ravine, to an abyss between lawlessness, which falls outside of the polity. And that becomes a big issue later on, and lawfulness, which is embraced by the states. So mend break is going to be an enormously important strategic element of everything that goes on. And you see the beginnings of mend break here. And so as you read the book, being aware of mend break strategies. And again, I should emphasize, this is not by any stretch Western notions of 0-1, right? We're not talking about binaries here. Mend break is not a Western style binary thing where you have one or the other. It is a strategic movement that is meant to get you to a particular position and to align a particular set of forces, both by creating and necessarily in the process of creating, of separating, breaking, and then ultimately dealing with what is mended and what is broken. So it's a great exercise for Western readers to get out of the binary thinking, the either or, and to think of this in a kind of much more fluid and strategic rhetorical sense.
Okay. Well, I think that pretty much summarizes chapter 3 in a good way. Is there anything else you would like to add to it? I believe that, and I say that because I believe that much of this discussion will add to chapter 4, and we'll be able to delve much deeper into it in chapter 4.
No, I agree. The only other thing I can add, and this is just horribly bad of me, is for all of you folks out there, buy the book, then you can read all the details.
Self-promotion at its finest.
That's right. I should put a picture of a coupon or something up.
I wonder are you allowed to do that? But all right, all right. Well, we will finish up here, and chapter 4 will be out fairly soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
All right.